Well, first, we were very serendipity, but 2 days ago we received an advance copy of the book. It will actually be published officially, I think it's January 4th, but we have a hard copy now. And the book is called Ghosts of Home, and its subtitle is The Afterlife of Chernovitz in Jewish Memory. Now, it's a book that is a little bit strange because it's about a place that, in fact, cannot be found in any contemporary atlas. It's about a community also for whom that place has remained alive, in the words of Aaron Appelfeld, like a wonderful gift and a relentless curse, long after the disappearance of the place called Chernovitz. The book is also a historical account of a German-speaking Jewish Eastern European culture that flourished in Chernovitz from the mid-19th century until it was shattered and dispersed in the era of World War II. But the book is also, what we try to do, it is also a family and communal memoir that spans 3 generations, and it explores, as the subtitle indicates, the afterlife in history and in memory of the city called Czernowitz. Now, let me just point out here, Chernovitz under Austro-Hungary was called Czernowitz, and it was the easternmost, it was the capital of the easternmost province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Bukovina. After World War I, 1918, it became Romanian. Because the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, the Romanians took it over, the city became Czernowitz. In the period right before the start of World War II, the Hitler-Stalin pact, and then in the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union took it over, and it became Chernovitz. And nowadays, it is part of the Republic of Ukraine, and it's Chernovitz. So the place itself, you know, like a kind of a shell of whatever it is, you know, what the animals has remained, but the animal has disappeared, and the animal largely that has disappeared is a very large Jewish population. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Now, the book is also based very much, in terms of sources. We use a great variety of sources, and kind of standard sources that historians would use, archives, photographs, all kinds of sources of that sort. But it's also very largely based on 3 trips, 3 main trips. We actually took more than 3 trips. So 3 main trips that we took to this place. The first one being in 1998 that Marianne and I took together with her parents. Her parents were born and raised in Czernowitz, although her mother, who was born in 1918, was already born in a place called Chernovitz, in Czernowitz, in the Romanian city. Her father was still born in Chernovitz. They took us back, and it was a kind of, I guess, in that sense, a kind of roots trip. You know, they had not been there since they left the city at the end of World War II in 1945. That was their first return trip, and we went with them. It's a trip that, in a sense, set the pattern because we started very early on to film or to video their trip and our trip. And so what we collected on that trip initially, in a sense that got us going for subsequent trips, were oral histories on the spot. The parents taking us to the various sites of their youth and other sites within that city and giving us the oral account. So that became a very central way of collecting material for us. It became a kind of not only back to the site, but the actual embodiment of that experience, returning to some place that one had left, that one had lived in, that one had experienced as a young person and for many, many years. And we were the co-witnesses to that experience. We went back a second time in 2000, at that point no longer with Marianne's parents, but we went first by ourselves actually. And we made a trip in which we actually took two people who had never been to Czernowitz, but who were also interested in going there, who had also had family from that area. One person, there was a cousin, David Kessler, whose father was very important in our book because he was a medical doctor who was sent to a concentration camp in Transnistria, and we subsequently actually now working on a memoir by his father. But we went with David Kessler and with another academic, a friend from Israel, Florence Hyman, who had also had a relative who subsequently has written a book in French, a very fine book in French about Chernovitz. So that was our second trip, and in that sense we were the guides now to these two people who had never been to this place, and they tried, now without parents, without any actual sort of living survivors from the period, to try to find the houses and the sites where their families had grown up and the places that they had experienced. So it became a sense we sort of by removal. Once removed, we were now the givers of oral history. Again, that whole second experience, 2000, we videoed, we filmed, and brought back material. And that second trip, we also made a short journey to a place called Transnistria, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Transnistria was the area to which hundreds of thousands of Jews were deported by the Romanians, and where many, 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 many thousands perished. We went with David Kessler because David Kessler's father had been in one of the camps in Transnistria. We went a third time to Czernowitz in 2006 as members of a...
We'll talk about that later, no? We'll talk about that.
We'll talk about it later. We'll just... So is that our third trip? Let me very briefly give you the kind of background history, and then we'll talk very much about these trips and about the collection of oral materials. Now, first of all, if we look at Czernowitz, it was as I said, the easternmost, the capital of the easternmost province of Austro-Hungary, and it had a very, very large Jewish population. Percentage-wise, actually much larger than Vienna, percentage-wise, not in effect. And like so many places that were ruled by the Habsburgs, starting in the 18th century, the Habsburgs decided in a policy of emancipation of various minority groups in order to centralize their authority. And part of the emancipation, by granting emancipation to minorities like Jews, in return, those who were emancipated, that is, who received rights to move around, to marry, to all kinds of rights that accumulated over a period until really 1868, when Jews received full political rights in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Gradual rights the Jews received, but in return for these rights, the expectation was that the population that received the rights would become Germanized. The idea was to centralize the state by Germanizing minority groups, by making them, in a sense, or inducing them to go to school, to dress like Germans, to become German in culture as much as possible. And the Jews in this place, as in so many other places in Central Europe, took to this policy extremely well. You had large numbers of Jews that assimilated, that picked up German, and German became their main language, displacing other languages, particularly Yiddish, which had been the language in the surrounding areas. and became their main language and their main literary language. Czernowitz produced some of the great writers, actually, poets of the 20th century, German-speaking poets of the 20th century who were German-speaking Jews. Paul Celan, who you may have heard of from this city, Rose Ausland, that came from this city. So during this period of Austrian rule, the city itself took on an Austrian character. Now this is what under the Austrians was the main center of politics of the city. It was the city hall. But the city itself, architecturally, picked up a lot of the architecture of Vienna. It prided itself in being Little Vienna. Its streets were named after Viennese streets. Its architects built railroad stations, built buildings, particularly in the second part of the 19th century when Austro-Hungary was ruled by Emperor Franz Joseph, which is a boom period for the Habsburg Empire. It's during this period that Czernowitz prided itself in being Little Vienna. And the population, particularly the Jewish population, which German-speaking Jews, prided itself in this fact. And some of these buildings that were built, for example, this building on one of the main squares was called the Jewish House, or
It was a Jewish cultural center.
the
really,
Jewish Cultural Center. And all floors of this really had activities in which there were clubs and other things that was involved in. As you can see, one of the squares here, they had an opera house, or a theater in this case, that was very much, again, modeled after Viennese theaters. It had a synagogue, in this case a temple, it was called, because it was very reformed for the time, modeled on what they called Moorish style. Very imposing building. Now this is already, this is Chernovitz. This is actually the temple during the Romanian period, but that temple was built at the end of the 19th century. That temple, not as, they didn't call it a synagogue, they had synagogues, but that was called the temple. That temple was burned when the Germans and Romanians came in at the beginning of World War II, returned to Czernowitz, and all that remains now is this part, which was transformed by the Ukrainians into a movie house. And it's now called, ironically, the Kinogoge instead of the synagogue, the Kinogoge, the Kino.
When we went there in 1998, Titanic was playing, If You Can See, so it's sort of
Now, in 1918, the Romanians took over. And when they took over Czernowitz, they tried to Romanianize the population, to force them to speak Romanian, to change the schools to Romanian schools, and so forth. But for the Jewish population, the advent of Romanian rule was actually very negative. The Romanians took away many of the rights that the Jews had had. Political rights, for example, under, as I said, in 1868, Jews became full political citizens of Austro-Hungary. When the Romanians came in, Jews became subjects again rather than citizens. During the period of the Romanian rule, also starting from 1918, and particularly through the 20s and rising into the 30s, Romanian anti-Semitism grew increasingly. Romanian fascism became stronger and stronger. The Romanians created a grouping very much like the Nazi Party that was virulently anti-Semitic, and so Jews began to experience direct and indirect anti-Semitism. They began to be excluded from schools, from universities, from professions, and so on and so forth during the Romanian period. And it was during this period, very early at the beginning of World War II, when the Romanians returned to Czernowitz after this very brief interlude when the Russians had run it for 1 year. I don't know if you all know the history of the Second World War, but right before the World War II started, there was a pact, the so-called Hitler-Stalin Pact, in which parts of Europe were divided between the Soviet Union and the Germans. And in that division, the northern Bukovina, which Czernowitz was the capital, fell to the Soviet Union. That lasted for 1 year. Then the Germans, together with their allies, the Romanians, invaded the Soviet Union and returned to Czernowitz. And returned to Chernovitz with a great rage, thinking that the Jewish population in particular that had been in Chernovitz had collaborated with the Russians. And they decided, really almost ahead of the Germans at that point, to get rid of the Jews. And first, what they did in Chernovitz is that they set up, and I show it to you here, a ghetto. This is a totally, you have to sort of imagine it as being a totally enclosed ghetto. All Jews were relegated to this ghetto. And then the policy was to ship as many Jews as possible off to this region between the Dniester River and the Bug River in the Ukraine called Transnistria. It's a region that is rather sizable, but it was a region that by the time the Jews were sent off from the Bukovina and from Bessarabia, from this area, that region that region had been already emptied of its local Jewish population by German Einsatzgruppen that had marched into the Soviet Union. So
You see here the orders to deport the Jews. So this is
These are
all very official. This is the one, and then
you see the original Romanian order and then the English translation of these orders. And you can see here, in accordance to the order of Marshal Antonescu, all Jews should be transported across the river Dniester within 10 days. Now, the point was to transport them across the river Dniester and basically dump them into this territory without food, without any resources, and perhaps during the worst winter of the second half of the 20th century,
So this
winter
is the
of 1941-42, thousands upon thousands died of starvation, but also from epidemics of typhoid. Here's some photos of this deportation of the Jews during this period from various places in the Bessarabia and Bukovina. This is the region called Transnistria. You see Odessa at the bottom of it. The rivers Dniester, Transnistria, that's really what Transnistria means. And across the other river, on the other side of it is the Bug River, which is under German control at the beginning of the war. So, I guess basically this is what. Yeah.
So this is by way of background. What we really want to talk about is a trip to Transnistria that we took with some survivors, and that we'll discuss a little bit more about memory and place. My own family was not deported, and I think that's the one piece that I wanted to add to Leo's introduction, and that has to do with the fact that in October, when you saw those deportation orders, they came from the central government in Bucharest, from the Marshal Antonescu, who was the military leader, dictator really of Romania, and the mayor of Czernowitz, of the city, Traian Popovici, was actually somebody who had been educated at the university in the city and had come to appreciate the very important Jewish presence of the city, and also and decided to try to save the Jews of the city. And he actually, it was very difficult, but he actually managed to save 20,000 or 60,000 Jews, to get special permits for them to remain in the city. And my family was among those. We described this at great length in the book, the selections, how that was made, and it was very, very difficult. And actually then, of the Jews who were deported to Transnistria, most of them died of hunger, typhus, and exposure in the first winter of 41-42, which was an incredibly difficult winter. But my family was actually saved from deportation, and so when we went in 2000 and then again in 2006 to visit this region, it was really to take the trip that they had not taken and to experience something and get to know something that had haunted me really through my whole childhood, because that was the feared place that they had not gone to. In any case, this world of Czernowitz, as Leo mentioned, has disappeared. And if it survives at all, now it's really in the memories of the survivors, who are now child survivors pretty much, or very, very old, and their children and grandchildren. And it has a very lively presence on the internet. So this is the Czernowitz.fs.com, the Czernowitz website, and there's a listserv, and it's an incredible resource where people who are descendants from the survivors and descendants from this place have kept the memory alive and have put up, as you can see from the links and the sidebar, incredible amounts of information, translations, images, memoirs, testimonies about the place, and photographs. And the listserv actually goes with, was established with the site, and is also an incredibly active. I think I get 25 to 30 messages per day from this group of hundreds of people really around the world. And on this listserv, people at one point, and it was sort of interesting how it happened, they started exchanging recipes. Like, does anyone have a recipe for this dish? My mother used to make it. And the recipe started being exchanged, and people said we should make a recipe book, and they did. And then somebody said, why don't we have a reunion? And so they started, and it was a very strange thing, like, what is a reunion of people who had really only met on the internet pretty much? So they started discussing this, and sure enough, a trip was planned for May 2006, and more than 60 people went to Czernowitz, really to compare the past and the present, the images that they had with them, and you see that a lot of the city actually remains.
They went to Chernovitz, but they actually went to Chernovitz.
They went to Chernovitz, but they thought they were going to Chernovitz, exactly. So they went to the modern city, which is this one. And in any case, here they are. This is part of the trip. And what they wanted to do is what we had experienced in 1998. They wanted to be there with each other. They wanted to be in a group, but they also wanted to be with some of the older people who could actually explain the place to them and share memories. And it was a very lively gathering, as you can see here, with bus trips. They organized talks about the place, and they organized a memorial service at the Jewish cemetery with some local Jewish residents who were not survivors of that time, but were, more recently a population that had come to this city more recently from other parts of the Soviet Union, because it had already been known as a Jewish center. So there was a lot of kind of sharing of information. They were searching for roots. They searched for documents that would certify their parents or their own presence there. They went to get their people who had left there as young children went to get their birth certificates, because that somehow seemed to ratify that they were from the place. They went to visit buildings and houses and apartments where their family had been from. Some of them went back to the schools and wanted to sit in the desk where they had sat as children. It was a very complicated trip, which we describe in the book, but that's not the trip that we will talk to you about now. So, it's very understandable why people would want to undertake such a journey. What was less understandable was the much smaller group that really wanted to return to Transnistria, to go to that place. And there was a 2-day bus journey that was attached to the trip. There were smaller trips to other villages where some had family that people could join that had been organized. But then there was this trip to Transnistria to experience the site of deportation. And here's where we want to read you a short section from the book where we describe this other trip which we joined and have some thoughts to share with you about. So we say, what did this side trip to Transnistria bring to its participants in terms of memory and history? What kind of pilgrimage is a trip to sites of deportation and trauma? What does one hope to find there? Much has been written about such visits from memorial and anthropological perspectives. Our own trip could not have been further removed in nature from the popular pilgrimages that many of you, I'm sure, have been hearing about. The museums, memorials, and tours that one can take in Poland or other sites in Eastern Europe mediate the power of that such a visit can have on survivors, on their descendants, and on more distant retrospective witnesses. Our trip, on the other hand, was nothing more than an excursion to a few small villages on the other side of Moldova, between Ukraine and and Transnistria. There's now another Republic of Moldova. And it was a trip with practical hardships and discomforts the two of us really knew about because we had already taken it in 2000. And we also knew that the promises of knowledge and enlightenment had already been betrayed for us on that occasion, and we were sure would be betrayed for some of the people who were taking the trip at the time. We knew that very few traces of the past could be found in the villages of Transnistria as it was in present day. So we had personal motives to go, in a sense, to revisit some of the places that my family had not gone to, some more distant family members had gone to. But really, mostly our motives for joining this trip were less personal. We thought of ourselves as observer witnesses rather than as involved participants. In our teaching and writing, we had begun to study return visits to sites of trauma, to wonder what memory they'd hold, what they might reactivate in the survivor returnee or in his or her descendants. Transnistria's lack of an institutionalized culture of remembrance, the disappearance of its Jewish population, and the oblivion that we had already observed in 2000 promised to make this visit particularly instructive. We thought if there is less memory on site, it might be more interesting to see what would happen when survivors went there. And yet, I have to say that the observer stance we adopted and the emotional distance that it was meant to protect vanished in less than 2 hours into the journey. Now, this is one of the very few memorials that does exist in Transnistria in a town called Mogilev, which is at the entrance of the place, and all it has is, this is a memorial to both the victims and the rescuers, and then there's one other memorial that just has the sites of a few sites of Kimlet. At the bottom of this, there's some sites with names. That's the only memorialization that's really available in the whole area. Well, very early in the morning of May 23rd in 2006, 17 of us plus a driver and 2 translators boarded this bus, a Ukrainian tour company bus that we had hired for this outing. And when we began to exchange stories, we discovered that of the 17, 4 of the people were child survivors of Transnistria. 1 had survived there as a teenager, and 1 was born immediately after his parents' repatriation to Czernowitz, Chernovitz at this point. 2 of the survivors had lost 1 parent there, and 1 had lost both parents there. The others came to trace the deportations of fathers, mothers, grandfathers, cousins, and other very close relations. And no one seemed to know exactly what to expect there, but everyone was apprehensive about the feelings that the journey might activate or provoke. Because of the driver's unfamiliarity with the route and our lack of a transit visa through the Republic of Moldova, he took us by way of a very lengthy detour northwestward, on which we encountered many bumps, twists, turns, and innumerable delays caused by large trucks or by herds of cows or goats or flocks of geese. And as the hour of travel passed, the outside temperature steadily rose as well. It was like over 90 degrees there, even though it was
40 degrees, 40 degrees centigrade is about 104, I think, actually, in the bus.
And as you can see here, repairs are being undertaken because the air conditioning stopped working by late morning and because the drive belt to the generator snapped. And we've stopped many times to try to repair it. It couldn't be repaired. And we soon also discovered that the onboard toilet, which is a feature that everybody had insisted on, was not functioning, so the driver had to make stops along the way so we could use the facilities in the woods for relief. And so the journey time increased ever more and seemed endless. After a short lunch stop, we came to cross the Dniester River and entered what had been Transnistria to drive to our first stop, Shargorod, and then to this town called Mogilev for the night. And here the scenic countryside became overwhelmingly beautiful. We were both astounded by the rich black soils, the acres upon acres of planted grains and oilseed buds that emblazoned the fields in a carpet of yellow. It was hard to imagine that some of these very same fields, frozen, windswept, brutally cold, seemingly limitless, were such torment to the many deportees who perished during their forced marches through this region. The incredible contrast between the splendid scenery and the horrors that it had witnessed 60 years ago underscored the incommensurabilities that visits to former sites of trauma can make so palpable. Despite the external beauty, or perhaps because of the incongruities it revealed, passengers on the bus became surprisingly argumentative as the trip progressed. Tensions mounted, apprehensions increased. The warmer it got, the longer the trip lasted, the more conflicts surfaced within the group. And these conflicts are really what we want to share with you today. By mid-afternoon, we arrived some 8 hours after our departure. Our bus stopped in a shade near a tree-lined square bounded by flower beds in the small town of Shargorod. In 1941, a ghetto demarcated by barbed wire barriers was established for Jews in a section of this town, and some 7,000 deportees, mainly from Bessarabia, but also from the Bukovina, were squeezed into it and compelled to seek shelter wherever they could find it. Yehudit, whom you see here, one of our fellow passengers, had been one of them. Together with her mother and father, she had survived the ghetto as a young girl, but both of her maternal grandparents died there from typhus during the epidemic in the winter of 1942. For a long time after the war, she told us, her parents told her stories about Chernovitz, nostalgic stories about their youth, marriage, and her birth there, but they refused to talk at all about Transnistria. And Yehudit's own childhood memories of this place had been repressed as well, until many years later in Israel, through an organization for child survivors named Amcha, she joined a child survivor therapy group in which details of her own experiences began to surface, along with that of other fellow survivors. And I'm now reading a lot more about these therapy groups, and that we should talk about them afterwards. They're very interesting because it seems to me that they feed a lot of memories to these former children. But she did recover a number of memories, and one of the reasons she really wanted to go back to the place was that she hoped that it would open up the past in new ways for her, allowing her to access some of the scenes she had repressed in their material, palpable dimensions. However, when we walked through the town that she hardly recognized, the resistances to remembrance did not easily fade. Nor was she able to find her grandparents' burial site that she was seeking. This was one of the very important things she wanted to find. Other than the 3 or 4 gravestone tips that still remained visible above an inaccessible brush-covered field at the edge of town, there was no visible trace that a Jewish cemetery had ever existed there. There was also no evidence or memorial indication of the mass graves that had been dug in the early 1940s for the numerous victims that had perished in this town. Nonetheless, Yehudit did find something totally unexpected in Shargorod, and perhaps even more consequential. It happened not long after our arrival on the town's main square. Our 2 translators, Luda and Natasha, had left us to search for someone local who might direct us to the site of the old Jewish quarters. And a short while later, they returned with the mayor of Shargorod, whom you see here from the back. Yehudit told him that she had been in the ghetto as a child with her parents. This is through the translator, of course. She wanted to let him know that she and her parents had managed to stay alive here due to the charity of local Ukrainians who gave them food, and who at one point, and at great risk to themselves, protected her mother and her during a roundup by Romanian gendarmes. She wanted to acknowledge them publicly because she would forever be grateful to these kind-hearted and brave local farm people whose names she had probably never known. The mayor, looking primarily at her, was visibly moved. Shargorod is a small town, he said in Ukrainian while Natasha translated. Still, he continued, before the war, some 4,000 Jews lived here. Their persecution and suffering is a stain on our memory. I acknowledge that suffering for which we Ukrainians also share responsibility. Now only some 30 Jews remain here. The absence of Jews is a loss for which I'm truly sorry. Pretty amazing. So if the beautiful Jewish synagogue, which you see here, of Shargorod had been turned into a winery, which you can see the truck right here of the winery, as we saw when we were taken there, and if no more than a handful of Jews remained in the town, then at least the mayor recognized the historical presence of Jews in Shargorod and their suffering. The very understated human exchange between him and Yehudit, facilitated by the translator's mediation and witnessed by our group and other bystanders from the town, did have a reparative force that we carried with us into the bus and into the continuation of our journey. To be sure, the mayor acknowledged the presence of Shargorod Jews before the war. That Jewish population had already been exterminated by the Einsatzgruppen before the Jews who had been deported from Bukovina, so before Yehudit came there. Was the mayor aware of these two layers of Jewish suffering in Shargorod? Does it matter? We don't know. In Shargorod, something was being remembered on site. Something had been transmitted, and it was a good beginning for our journey. When we got back on the road, however, the good feelings dissipated rather quickly, and conflicts again came to the fore among the group. It became clear that the journey was taking longer than planned, and that we would have difficulty fitting everything we wanted into the 2 days. When the trip was being planned, we had been asked about places in Transnistria to visit that were personally most meaningful to us, and Shargorod, Mogilev Podolsk, and Bershad were submitted to the tour company as primary goals. Arthur Rindler, who was one of the group members and a child survivor, had also wanted us to stop in Budi, a small town where his mother had perished during their forced march east. Arthur's request was certainly reasonable and totally agreeable to many people on the bus. Why, after all, would we undertake such a trip without stopping in a town that was so significant to a member of the group, even though doing so entailed a significant detour? But others aboard the bus, primarily some of the other child survivors and their spouses, challenged Arthur's request. How was he so sure that his mother had died there in that particular place, one of them asked him. He had, after all, been less than 5 years old at the time. Why should his memory be trusted, and why should we have to make this detour? Despite the fact that we were not scheduled to be in the Budi area until our second day in Transnistria, the skepticism about Arthur's memory and request was expressed impatiently, as though we had to decide right then and there if the detour was going to be made. Arthur's hurt and indignation were immediately discernible. Why would anyone want to challenge his recollections? For most of his life, he said, he had been haunted by flashbacks of his mother lying next to him, cold, when he woke up in the morning in a cowshed where he and his parents had found shelter during their time in Budi. His memories of this period came back to him in black and white, he told us. And he said it was like a movie with some scenes cut out, missing. It's a beautiful image, really. I want to go back to Budi, he said, fill in some of those missing pieces, and say Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, for my mother. Maybe that could help me to bring some closure. I mean, he was a very interesting man, and he had been a very successful professional. He had just retired, and he knew there was some part of his life that was missing, and this trip was very, very important because it was going to fill in that piece and allow him to grow old, really. As we moved forward toward particular sites within Transnistria, not only Arthur, but some of the other child survivors on the bus began nervously to draw into themselves and to shrink physically. Their faces reflected an overwhelming sense of anxiety. At the same time, however, the strife and negativity continued. Why did we stop for lunch so early? Why were we stopping at every cemetery, somebody asked them. When were we going to see the cemetery in Bershad? Others insisted. Nothing was right. Where we had expected solidarity and mutual sympathy, a sharing of past experiences, a feeling of community, we found wrangling, competition, and bickering. We were, of course, conscious of the fact that a number of our travel companions had suffered severe trauma as young children. And we were sufficiently familiar with the literature on childhood trauma to know about some of its recurring manifestations. Dori Laub, a psychoanalyst who was himself a child survivor of Transnistria, of the deadly camp of Carriera de Piatra, describes his own heightened awareness of details from the time, a precocious remembrance of events that seemed, as he writes, far beyond the normal capacity for recall in a young child. He also notes discontinuities in memories of childhood trauma, indicating in his own case, and I quote, "These memories are like discrete islands of precocious thinking and feel almost like the remembrances of another child, removed, yet connected to me in a complex way." When we subsequently discussed our trip with him after our return to the United States, he told us that he never wanted to go back to Transnistria, fearing perhaps that we had the occasion to witness on our journey, the loss of the doubling and projection that locates the trauma outside himself in the persona of another child. This is how he writes about it. As we neared the village of Budi on our second day in Transnistria, after taking a short detour off the main road to Bershad, Arthur requested that we all permit him and his wife Greta to descend the bus by themselves and that we return to fetch them again a while later. He had become quiet and withdrawn as we neared Budi, focusing his glance out of the window. At one point he asked the bus driver to slow down so he could snap a photo of one of the cow sheds we passed. This is actually his photo. In Budi, he said, in Budi, in a cow shed similar to that one, we spent our first winter in Transnistria. All these sheds have only one story, but ours had two stories, and we never found one that had two stories that he could photograph. It looked a little bit like this one, but it was different. Shortly thereafter, we approached a cluster of modest, well-kept houses on a fairly recent vintage, and a signpost reading Budi on a small, grass-covered circular island that divided the road. No people, stores, or even cars were visible. Placing a kippah, head covering on his head, and carrying a small prayer book, Arthur got off there with Greta, and he walked to the sign. It was clear that he was about to fulfill what he had set out to do, to save the mourner's cottage for his mother. But since he had absolutely no knowledge of where in this village his mother's burial site was located, he stood at the entrance of Budi at the post that marked its physical location. And so we drove off with the bus, and then when we returned, we saw Arthur take some photographs and place a stone by the Budi sign to mark their visit. This is what the Jewish practice of placing a stone on a grave site, but of course there was no grave site, there was only the entrance to his town. After this, Arthur slowly began to brighten up. Soon he was telling stories and conversing in a good-humored way on the bus. He felt lighter, he told us later in the afternoon, as if some weight had been removed from his chest. He felt that he had attained some closure on the past. Later in the day, a powerful image fragment that had once meant so much to him as a child in Transnistria had suddenly again flashed before his eyes as he looked out of the bus window. Outside now, like then, sunshine had broken through overcast clouds. It recalled for him a late winter day in the Bershad ghetto where he had gone with his father after Budi, and where they survived the warriors under great duress. One day, he told us, on a snowy tree branch illuminated by the sun's rays, he saw a beautiful red bird. Instantly he knew that this was a sign that spring was coming, and that the war would end, and that they would be liberated and allowed to return home. And now again he sensed the promise of renewal and release, this time, however, less physical and more psychological, if not spiritual. Perhaps, he said, it was a signal to let go and move on.
In the late morning, we arrived in Bershad, a surprisingly bustling mid-sized town with a central avenue and tree-lined sidewalks lined by recently built and renovated buildings and stores. By the way, this is one thing I wanted to highlight for you. In our own imagination, and I think in the imagination of a lot of people, when they thought about Transnistria, they always thought about it in black and white, you know, like think about a black and white movie. And of course, when you get there, parts of it are incredibly beautiful, as I just pointed out. And even these towns, which we always only consider in terms of being a ghetto, also were now some rather large, bustling town. After inquiring about the location of the Jewish ghetto, we drove a few blocks from the core area and reached an unpaved road too narrow for the bus. We walked into the small area in which many thousand Jews had been confined in the early 1940s. In our group, besides Arthur and his father, Rita's parents and grandparents had been interned there, as had Batya, as a young girl left alone in an orphanage run by the ghetto's Jewish communal organization after her mother died from typhus and her father was sent to the German side of the book to do forced labor, and where he was killed. Batya had been particularly impatient to reach Bershad and to find the ghetto. But even more so, she was eager to visit the Jewish cemetery, where she hoped to find some trace of her mother's burial place, even if only within the site of one of its mass graves. The unpaved road on which we now walked, rutted from the weather and without sidewalks, was lined with small grayish brick or clay wood trimmed cottages with corrugated metal roofs. Most of these seem to be inhabited by impoverished Ukrainians, Roma, or recent immigrants from the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. Almost all the houses we passed were in a state of disrepair, with broken window panes, rain gutters and stairs broken, rust-eaten roof panels, peeling paint, collapsed walls and ceilings. The small yards were covered with overgrown grasses, gnarled bushes, and fallen branches. The Bershad Jewish ghetto consisted of approximately 12 narrow roads like the one we were on, and 2 wider main streets. In the autumn of 1941, not long after the ghetto's creation, it had been the destination of more than 25,000 deportees from Chernovitz and surrounding villages who were forced to find some space within it, a virtually impossible ordeal. In the ensuing harsh winter month in which the temperatures in the region occasionally plunged to minus 40 degrees centigrade, and the typhus epidemic raged, many thousands died here. Their bodies, unable to be buried because of the frozen ground and the lack of sufficiently healthy workers, remained piled in the snow for weeks before they could be taken away. 8 months later, in May 1942, only some 10,000 deportees remained alive in this ghetto. This is very, very similar to Hartford said, but it is not our house, because our house was right near the entrance of the main square, exactly like this one. It had slats going off from the door. The windows there were just like the windows here on this one, but this cannot be it. Arthur's comment was indicative of our visit to Bershad. Nothing we found corresponded to what people in our group were actually searching for, and yet deep-sense memories were activated for many. We heard that there was a Bershad museum, but it was closed on Tuesdays. Let me just get about the museum part. The synagogue we visited as a group, and that was opened for us by an ancient-looking, hunched-over man in tattered clothing who collected for us, who collected tzedakah, which was charity. One of the last Jews alive there, was the most desolate place yet. The beautiful but neglected whitewashed building had no doubt been imposing in its prime. It's very old. The dark and damp interior had long since ceased serving its former function. What layers of memory did it hold, and who might unlock them? For most participants in our group, the cemetery promised to offer a more definitive sense of closure and repair than the former ghetto. Surrounded by a whitewashed wall and fronted by an impressive decorative black wrought iron gate and 2 large stars of David, it was outside of the town, about a mile from the ghetto area. We had read about the cemetery in Ruth Gold's memoir, and 2 passages stood out in our memory. The first about sneaking off with a group of other orphans from that same orphanage in the spring of 1943 that Batya was, to find the resting place of their parents and other relatives. And the second relating a brief return visit to this place in 1988. Recalling the 1943 search, Ruth Gold wrote, I quote, "Trembling with fear, I looked around, but there wasn't a single sign to indicate the last resting place for the thousands of victims who had perished during the devastating winter of 41-42. Walking deeper into the cemetery, I noticed some fresh graves of various sizes but no markers. Suddenly I made a grisly discovery. Scattered throughout the whole area were entire unburied skeletons and individual bones, human bones that covered the soil like shells on a beach. My search for a mass grave was futile. There were only bones and more bones, a phantasmal nightmarish vision. Momentarily it occurred to me that among these bones might also be those of my family. Late in 1943, however, as Romanian authorities permitted Jews in Transnistria to receive some financial help from relatives who had escaped deportation, the Bershad Jewish Communal Organization decided to use some of these funds to build a monument in a cemetery to memorialize local victims buried in mass graves. Amazingly, that monument was quickly erected, a 5-sided prism topped by a Star of David, whose sides on marble plaques bore the names of many of the thousands of Bershad victims, and a Hebrew inscription by Rabbi Beryl Yesser of Berlin. When Ruth Gold visited the cemetery in 1988, however, she was greatly disappointed. The monument was nowhere to be found. In 1988, Ruth Gold could not find any remaining traces of it, and neither, of course, did we. By the time many of us in this group came together in the rear part of the cemetery, we all, but especially child survivors in the group, were extremely stirred up emotionally by what we had seen in the old Bershad ghetto and here. We were stirred up especially by the absence of a visible mass grave or a memorial that could commemorate the deaths of relatives of each of us had come to honor.
We collected small stones, so there was no place to put them. Without discussing anything, we all searched together, winding our way across sunken and unmarked graves towards a clearing where a number of gravestones from the 1940s and newer monuments with some inscribed names could be seen. It corresponded neither to the descriptions of the 1943 monument nor the old weathered one Ruth Gold had found. It was larger, square, seemingly erected quite recently by an international organization to honor the victims. We were relieved to locate it, read some of the inscriptions, and then most of us moved away to make space for Batya, who stood by it, silent, next to her husband. Had she in any way found what she was looking for? She never said, and in fact, she never communicated a sense of closure, just unending sadness and desolation.
As you can see, one of the things she's doing, this is her, she's taking photos of it. So, what we want to end with is some thoughts about memory and place. Indeed, our journey with child survivors towards places most associated with their personal traumatic past, we witnessed the loss of the protective shield invoked by Dory Laub that enables survivors to live with their trauma. We witnessed a regression into a childhood state that became visible in their bodily affect and evident to their verbal arguments, in their reenactment of competitive and aggressive behaviors that maybe some of them may have needed to manifest decades ago as young children struggling for subsistence in the realm of extreme deprivation. And as their co-witnesses at the very places where they were traumatized as children, we found ourselves drawn into the depths of their affect as well, into what we might think of as a loss without memory and without history. What an effect does place bring to the act of memory and to traumatic recall? Does it contain history or memory, or does it not? This is sort of leaving Bershad, and now we're in the process of leaving Transnistria. When we left, we were on the bus. Everybody was totally exhausted, parched. It was still very hot. And one of the participants in the trip, a doctor who was the husband of Florence Heyman, who had also come there sort of for research purposes like we did, but we were all very drawn into it, decided to ask people. It was going to be a very long trip back, maybe 8 hours. It was already dark. Decided to ask people to share some impressions of the trip. And since they had all fought so much, we both thought this was a terrible idea. But sure, and it was actually mostly happening in Hebrew because most of the survivors who had come on the trip were currently living in Israel. So we actually don't speak Hebrew, but Florence Heyman, who was translating it for me into French, and we taped it and then got the transcript translated into English for us. So, but even though we didn't understand all the words that people were saying as it was happening, we understood a lot about what they were trying to say. So we want to end this talk by just quoting two statements that people had made. One was by a woman named Miriam, who had been incredibly ornery during the whole trip, and it was never clear why she was in such a bad mood. She said, she got up and she said, "I did not know what to expect. I was very, very small when I was here. I don't like opening my wounds, but today I did. I picked my scabs. I am in shock. I don't know how this trip will affect me. I am strong. I didn't sink into depression. I have enjoyed life all these years. I want to say something that will shock you. My bladder betrayed me twice on this trip. I'm not sure if this is due to the shock or to my age, but I remember the first moment we came back from this pit, meaning when they were repatriated, when they were liberated. The same thing happened. I tried to hide it then, but now I'm not ashamed. It's what happened." And she said she had lost her parents on the trip. "I hope to come back from this trip with my sanity and with the ability to laugh and be happy again. But I don't know what this will do for me in the future. All I want is to transmit it to my children. How I will do that, I don't yet know." And the second statement is from a man named Danny Alon Ellenbogen, who was actually both second and third generation. His grandfather had been deported to Transnistria, and his grandfather in Israel was too old to take the trip. So Danny and his father took the trip. So his father was the second generation, Danny was the third generation. And he was a doctor, he's a doctor in Israel and very, very active in organizing the trip. And he said, Transnistria was always a synonym of hell for me. So when we started the ride yesterday, I felt that everything around me, the Ukrainian villages, the landscape I saw, was irrelevant. Today, I feel a big change in me. Something momentous moved inside me on this trip. I felt like I could connect to the stories I had heard throughout my life. I called my grandfather from Mogilev on my cell phone. I wanted him to hear the sounds by the river he had crossed in such misery decades ago. I wanted to let him hear directly from this spot, and despite it all, we have survived it. And I called my grandmother's sister from the former ghetto in Bershad. She was so excited to hear my voice, and she said, Danny, when are you coming home? I said, tomorrow. I could tell her I'd be back tomorrow. I'm not taking this return for granted, and I know I come back from this trip a more complete person.